So we're talking with Anand Gopal, uh, former reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who also wrote a great book called No Good Men Among the Living, which for my money, it's I think you could call it a book of recent or current history. And for my money, it's one of the best books of that sort that I've read. So we're very happy to have Anand here. One of the things that really stands out about your book, I think, is the manner in which you, I guess you could call, researched it, what you did in order to write it. And maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. When I got to Afghanistan, I wasn't part of a news bureau or anything. I was kind of independent. So as a result, I couldn't actually afford to hire fixers and translators and the other usual people who would normally be in those circumstances. So I ended up having to learn the language and kind of move with a segment of Afghans who usually aren't the types that end up becoming friends with international journalists. And that was just really by dumb luck that happened to me. And so I ended up, hanging out with these guys, much more working class people, poor people who just operate in a different milieu than some of the English speaking Afghans. And so they took me to different parts of the country, especially to the areas where the war was being fought at the time. And when I was doing that, I just started to hear lots of stories about the war on terror that were looking very different from, or sounding very different from, the stories that we had been hearing up until then.
So when reading about that, it really sounds like a great adventure in one sense. I'm wondering if there's any one or two particular incidents or situations that stand out in your mind that can bring it more to light for people who are hearing this or watching it.
Yeah, I mean, there was fairly early on, I went to an area of Kandahar province called Bandi Timur, which is really historically been one of the most impoverished and neglected parts of Kandahar province. And when I was there, I noticed that, well, first of all, many of the houses were empty, were completely destroyed. In some cases, there were only women living there, or sometimes just children. All the fighting age males had been killed or had fled. And as I spent time in that community, I began to realize that almost every single household in that community had a member in the Taliban. And I was coming to that area and to Afghanistan, I think, with a very simplistic understanding of the Taliban as, as just an extremist group that you kind of have to be basically beyond the pale to join. And so what struck me about that is that instead what we had in that community, at least, was people from different walks of life, mostly farmers, school teachers, etc., had all joined, or every household had one member who joined. And it wasn't even necessarily because they supported the Taliban as a political project. It was rather that they had been facing pretty extreme violence committed by the US and the US-backed forces, that they just looked at whoever could give them protection. And so many people took up weapons against the occupiers and would join the Taliban in that way. So that really made me change my understanding of the conflict.
I want to return to that later, but also in your book, you give a very interesting explanation of how the strong tribal traditions developed in many parts of Afghanistan. I wonder if you could summarize that.
Well, yeah, so the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan are tribal communities, and what that means is that there's the communities there basically are kinship-based or fictive kinship-based communities. What that means is that they believe that they hail from a common ancestor, or that they have a common founder of their group. And there's hundreds of Pashtun tribes across southern and eastern Afghanistan. In eastern Afghanistan, the tribes tend to be, historically at least, they were tended to be much more egalitarian, at least among the men, in the sense that there were no tribal leaders as such. They would have these tribal assemblies in which every man in the tribe would have an equal say or a vote in whatever happened, and they had their own forms of uh, dispute resolution because there was no central state. So if if there was a crime that was committed, they had their own set of rules that had been passed down for generations or centuries on how to deal with that. In southern Afghanistan, the situation was a bit different because you had the state that penetrated these areas, and so you had really the rise of a feudal class of big landowners in southern Afghanistan. Khans are what they're called in the local language, big landowners, and so they became the tribal leaders as well, and so the kind of egalitarian ethos of the eastern tribes didn't exist in the south, and so the dispute resolution mechanisms were pretty heavily tilted in favor of the strongmen or the big feudal lords. And so as a result, especially in southern Afghanistan, you had developed a kind of alternative form of dispute resolution based on religion, and that's where the word Taliban comes from. It's those religious students who used to be imams, or they used to dispute have courts, religious courts, and that's an old phenomenon that goes back centuries in southern Afghanistan.
But you also talk in your book about how some of the tribal traditions developed out of out of Afghanistan being so mountainous, groups being somewhat isolated, communities being isolated from each other, and how people had to band together in extended family groups for mutual protection from raiding and so on.
That's right. Yeah, that's kind of explaining why these parts of the country were tribal. It's really that there's a clannishness that developed as a way to best deal with the environment that they lived in which, yeah, as you said, there were rival clans and raiding communities, and there wasn't a strong central state in any of these places. And so this is kind of the material origins for why these areas were clannish.
Right. And you also explain that the Taliban's imposition of so-called Sharia law has less to do with Islam as a religion and more to do with some of the tribal traditions of the Pashtun in certain regions.
Well, yeah, I think so there is a tribal law that exists, as what I referred to earlier, which is or tribal code. Pashtunwali is that, and then there is the Taliban's legal approach, or their Sharia law, is frequently kind of adapts itself to local circumstances. So just to give an example, when the Taliban took over the country last month or a month and a half ago, one of the first things they did was to stop women and girls from going to school. There's nowhere in most ordinary interpretations of Islamic law that bars women from going to school or from working, and so what the Taliban were doing there wasn't really an expression of Sharia, and they didn't even justify those charges, right? Really responding to the norms of the village, the rural village, the countryside, where women, especially in the southern areas, women aren't able to leave the house very freely. There's generally a kind of a norm against women going to school, or women working outside the house. And so in many ways, the Taliban are more a reflection of some of those mores, at least when it comes to the question of women.
Passing on to the role of the United States, you write that in the vagaries of this system, not you, but you generically survived one way and one way only, through the ruthless exploitation of everyone around you. The broken alliances, the faltering hopes, the rude exposures of foreign agendas all dictated a certain logic of duplicity if you plan to remain alive and free. And you also call Afghanistan under the US, quote, a Potemkin country, but almost entirely for show. Can you expound on these comments a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, when the US invaded, the Taliban was defeated swiftly, within 3 months. And the Taliban leadership from the senior levels down to the rank and file more or less just quit, surrendered, and went back home. They melded back into civilian life and became farmers or teachers, etc. And the Al-Qaeda, the other principal target of the invasion, fled the country. So you had thousands of troops, U.S. troops on the ground without an enemy to fight. And so this is a contradiction. And the way that contradiction was resolved is that the U.S. brought in warlords and strongmen who had been expelled previously from the country, brought them back into the country and started to pay them for intelligence. It started to say that, find us terrorists, find us bad guys. And so these warlords or strongmen would basically use this as an opportunity to finger their rivals. To, if there was some land that they were eyeing, they could they could tell the Americans, oh, that person living on that piece of land is a member of Al Qaeda or the Taliban, and the U.S. would just arrest people or torture them or send them to war, almost no questions asked. It was just essentially for 3 or 4 years a one-sided war waged by the U.S. and its allies against poor Afghan villagers. The system that the United States set up and incentivized, this war on terror system, was that actual evidence didn't matter, actual membership in an organization or even your activities of doing something again matter. What mattered is what these warlords said, and therefore that's what the U.S. would follow through on.
How do you explain that position, that role of the U.S., given that they claimed that they were going into the country to get rid of the Taliban?
Well, they did get rid of the Taliban. The problem is that, I think you have to look at this in the larger geopolitical context of the war on terror. So Afghanistan, I think at the time, for the architects of this war, was the opening salvo of a war on terror whose aim was to redraw the map of the Middle East and South Asia to better align with US imperial interests. And so that meant first Afghanistan as the lowest hanging fruit in that. We'd go to Afghanistan, we would overthrow the government and put in a client regime, which is headed by Karzai, have a small number of troops there to shore up that client regime, and then move on to Iraq. Do the same in Iraq, and then ultimately the greatest prize is Iran. So that was the plan, I think, of the architects of the war at the early time. And so for that plan to work, the ideology of the war on terror had to be central to it, that there were these terrorists and these bad guys all around the world they hated us for our freedoms, and they were ready to attack us and do another 9/11 at any minute. And that meant that reality, even if reality said otherwise, then well, to hell with reality. So we had troops on the ground in Afghanistan, and they couldn't find terrorists because there were none. Well, then we had to manufacture those terrorists, and that's essentially what happened.
So passing on to a different aspect of the question. In your book, you kind of trace the lives of a number of different people. And one of them was this woman, Hila, whose life was kind of a roller coaster ride, from a relatively liberated woman in Kabul to the classic oppression of a housewife in rural Pashtun society, then to becoming a senator. Now, your book was published in 2014, and I'm wondering if you know anything about what's happened to her since then.
Yeah, so she eventually, so the way she became a senator was that she kind of allied with a strongman, a US-backed strongman. And it kind of is a window into the way politics really works, where you have this facade of democracy in Afghanistan during that time. But behind it was a series of strongmen and power brokers. And she understood that, and she allied himself with that strongman and became a senator. Eventually, for various reasons, one of which is because she was independent-minded and strong-minded, that she ran afoul of that strongman and was no longer assured of his patronage. And so she managed to escape the country a couple of years back, and now she's living in asylum in a third country.
Okay. In relation to that, there's been a lot of talk about a new generation of women in Afghanistan, women who came of age, being educated and getting jobs and so on. And so, in your view, to what degree is that true? And also, to what degree does this include women beyond the middle-class women in Kabul and other major cities?
Yeah, I mean, it is true for middle-class women in Kabul and other major cities, and it's not true for poor women in Kabul, and also for poor women and middle-class women who are in the countryside. Specifically in the, I mean, when I say the countryside, Afghanistan is 70% rural. Maybe half the countryside is where the war was fought over the last 20 years. And in that half, that 50%, life is not what it's been described generally in the in television screens. I mean, under the Taliban in the 90s, women were locked in their homes. They were not allowed to, they didn't have access to education or healthcare. Under the US occupation, they were still locked in their homes, still didn't have access to education or healthcare. And on top of that, their houses could be bombed. On top of that, their loved ones were taken away. They would go to sleep at night not knowing if somebody's going to break into their house and take away their husband or son or brother. So in that respect, life actually got worse for those women in the last 20 years under American occupation than it did under the Taliban, which is not saying anything good about the Taliban. It's just showing what an utter failure the US occupation was.
As I understand it, in a lot of regions in Afghanistan, um, property ownership and inheritance is passed down strictly through the men. And so it seems to me that there would be no real change in terms of the position for women in society unless that is changed. But I don't see how that can change without property relations in general being changed. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, according to traditional norms and tribal laws and etc., women don't have any rights to property. Under Sharia law, women do have rights of inheritance. And so one of the things the Taliban sometimes did when they actually acted according to Sharia law and not according to, the village customs, what they sometimes did was actually enforce that, and therefore women were able to inherit some property. But so there are mechanisms, because there is a system in place with Sharia, which actually allows women to do that. But I think your point is right, which is that I think there's a lot of focus on what might be important but superficial or formal freedoms for women, like education and going to school, right? It's important that girls should be allowed to go to school. It shouldn't be illegal for them to go to school. But even when these girls go to school, what happens when they graduate? I mean, there's no jobs for them whatsoever. They're only going to go back and become a housemaker after they're done. And so without actually broadly shifting the economic structure of society, efforts to improve the condition of women, I think, are only going to go so far. And that's why we saw, like, what the US occupation did was it put a heavy emphasis on having girls go to school, and had a lot of NGOs and others who were supporting that, but without actually trying to shift the underlying basis of the economy. So once the US left, we just got back to the status quo ante.
So, I mean, there's been some of the NGOs that, for instance, encourage women to open up small businesses and so on. But as long as the general property relations don't change, seems to me it's questionable how much that sort of thing can really succeed in changing the situation.
Yeah, and I mean, like, NGOs that are encouraging women to own businesses, that's fine, and that's going to affect like 0.1% of women. That's not the sort of thing that's going to help the conditions of women. It's a primarily agrarian economy first and foremost, right? So there's in which the vast majority of the workforce is either a state employee, which is now going to be drastically reduced because of the drawdown on, or is in the agrarian workforce, which is really the majority of the population. What's the incentive for families to send their girls to school if you're going to be a farmer at the end of this? And so this is a deeper issue. And then, yeah, so that's part of it. And then property relations is, I think, a part of it. If by property relations you're meaning who gets the inherit property, that's certainly part of it. But I think it wouldn't just be who gets inherit property, because it also has to be the ability of women to make money, to earn. money, which isn't there right now because the economy just doesn't have jobs for women outside of teachers.
So if I were a major landowner in, I think you mentioned southern Afghanistan, I would be very, very resistant to opening up the question of whether women can inherit property, because I wouldn't want to open up the question at all of property relations and who owns property in the first place. That's a can of worms that could be very dangerous.
Well, yeah, I think so. And it's primogeniture in these places, so it's all goes to the men, and that already is a problem because they have many sons and they divide the land. You know, and then after a couple of generations, you have families with small plots. So it's definitely an issue. But I would say it's something that's not only just in the interest of big landowners. This is why I'm saying even small landowners, right? I mean, it's like if you what happens often is there'll be a family and the husband dies. Under the rights of Sharia, the woman, his wife, should inherit the land, but the husband's brothers will want the land, and so they will try to get the land either by force or by marrying the widow. And this is also why there's this tradition in the countryside that if a woman's husband dies, she'll marry the brother. And there's now, because of the war, there's been women who've had 4 husbands serially who've been killed, all brothers, for example. All of that are local adaptations to keep land within the male side of the family, which is also ultimately harmful for women.
So if there's a general shortage of land or general poverty, I mean, it seems to me that would be an underlying issue for the whole question of the oppression of women in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, doesn't mean if there's enough land that it means that women won't be oppressed, because there's also needs to be, changes, but this is maybe a structural constraint, I think, but there are other cases in other parts of the world that are land poor environments that have a better sort of more equitable ratio between men and women. I think here in Afghanistan, what I'm doing is that it's not a lot of arable land. I think a very small percentage of the country is arable, and it's right now seen as, at least in tribal law, as entirely belonging to the men.
And now on the question of the Taliban, you're probably aware some on the left here in the United States say that the Taliban returned to power because they were seen as the true patriots who drove out the American invaders. Do you agree with that point of view?
Well, no, I don't think it's hard to. So Afghanistan doesn't have a national political movement at all of any sort. The only national organization in Afghanistan is the Taliban, meaning they're the only organization that draws people from different communities and different tribes and different ethnic groups. With that being said, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily like a popular resistance force as such. It's rather that the other side is so unpopular, and people are craving some kind of stability and order after 40 years of war. That if you have a national organization that can end the war and stabilize things, people will acquiesce to that. And so I think that's a better way to characterize it. This isn't like the Viet Cong or something. This is not, a nationwide liberation force in the same way.
My understanding was that originally the Taliban were based mainly or even almost exclusively amongst the Pashtun, and in particular the Pashtun in a particular region, I think around Kandahar. What do you think of that? And if that, you seem to be saying that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, the first iteration of the Taliban were very heavily Pashtun and very heavily Kandahari and from neighboring provinces around Kandahar. The second, and the reason is because when that first iteration emerged, it came in the midst of a civil war. And the Taliban were, as I mentioned earlier, kind of a traditional presence going back centuries in Kandahar and Helmand. This is part of the local fabric there. So they came out of there and then took over the country. The new iteration of the Taliban is different because the new iteration is basically it's a patchwork of various communities that have been excluded from the post 2001 U.S. order. So that that looks different in different places. In some places it's a particular tribe. In some places it's a particular ethnic group. In some places it's a particular just a community. It's not a tribe, right? All of them are linked together by their mutual antipathy to the United States and the nation because they've been excluded from patronage, they've been killed, they've been attacked for all these reasons. So it's a much broader network of people when we're talking about the rank and file. So it includes Uzbeks and Tajiks and others. But when we talk about the leadership of the Taliban, it is still heavily Kandahari, primarily Kandahari Pashtun, and secondarily from the southeastern provinces, also Pashtun. So the leadership is still very much within those two groups.
But in your book, you would describe, I think it was around, well, in some of the Hazara areas, where when the Taliban came in, they, from my understanding of your description, they ruled as an occupying force themselves, as a foreign occupying force.
Yeah, in the 90s, I mean, they committed some horrific massacres in the Hazara areas. But today, I think it's a bit different in that respect. I mean, there are even Hazara members of the Taliban, including Hazara commanders who've joined. It's doesn't mean the Taliban are going to be popular in Hazara areas. They're not, and there's a lot of mistrust because of that history. But at the same time, for example, the Taliban were defending Hazara mosques during the recent religious Shia religious ceremonies. Hazara are Shias. So they're not, the Taliban are not like ethno-nationalist or sectarian. It's almost because they're not even they're just traditionalists. They're very much village based, and their world is but their worldview and their values are formed from the Pashtun village. And this is really the problem that they have, is that whatever parts of the country they come from, the policies they impose are the policies of the mores of the Pashtun village. And the thing is, Afghanistan is a very diverse country. You have very conservative places, like most of the Pashtun areas, where you can go days without seeing a single woman outside. And then you have places like Kabul that are a bit more, I would say, a little bit more socially liberal, at least for Afghan standards. And so when the Taliban come and they impose the Pashtun mores onto Kabul, that's where you get all these problems.
So, in the media today, you're seeing some claims that, oh, the Taliban today are different, that they've reformed, that they're going to rule. And in fact, some of their leadership is saying, we've learned from the past, we're going to rule differently. I get the impression that it's more of that layer of the leadership that has a little more of an international perspective. So do you think that they will try to rule somewhat differently, possibly in less violent ways? And if so, would you foresee divisions opening up, possibly violent ones within the Taliban, and also possibly some of the more extreme forces, such as maybe ISIS-K, start to gain adherence from the Taliban?
Well, so now the Taliban have been in power for a little over 2 months, right? And so we can begin to see, we can begin to put their words to the test of the rule so far. And it's still early, but some positive signs are that they are not ruling as brutally as they did. Sorry, I have a firehouse near me.
Yeah.
They're not ruling as brutally as they did in the 90s. For example, we don't have, should I pause here to this passes?
Sure. Okay. Okay.
The public executions in the soccer stadiums. In the 90s, all girls were banned from school and employment. That's not the case now. Girls are starting to go back to school. Some private universities are functioning, and women are still working in various ministries and stuff. Part of the reason for this change, I think, is there's been the middle class Afghans who benefited a lot from American occupation have have gained a lot, right? And they've have raised expectations as a result, and so they've had some pretty heroic protests, for example, against the Taliban. And that would never happen really in the 90s, and people would have just been shot dead. And so that's one. The international attention is way higher now than it was in the 90s. So the Taliban are trying to be on their best behavior. But you're right, actually, there are different tendencies within the movement. There are the more pragmatic minded tendencies that realize that, hey, if we don't play by the rules of the international community, then they're going to increase the isolation of the Taliban. No government has recognized it yet. There's no funding going into the country. So the treasury is empty. The banks are closed. Public sector workers haven't been paid since June. So it's a dire situation there. And there's an element of the leadership that says, hey, we better, act in certain ways that won't bring the hammer down harder on us. There are others who are really hardliners, who are mostly military guys who've been fighting in the trenches for 2 decades, lost a lot of family members to American violence and Afghan government violence. And they say, to hell with this, we should just rule the way we want. There are other factions, as the Haqqani network, which is another group of Taliban that are in the southeast. And I think that if the economic crisis isn't sorted out, it's very likely the Taliban might implode and break into factions, and we might see another civil war. I think ISIS-K obviously would benefit from that chaos. The difference between ISIS-K and the rest of the Taliban is Taliban do have a base in certain rural communities. I don't think ISIS-K or ISKP has a real social base in the country. They are Salafis, Wahhabis. Taliban are not Wahhabis. Taliban are Sufis, and they're part of the local tradition. ISIS-K is really not. So I don't expect that they would really be able to do anything outside of just sowing more chaos.
So do you agree that the US and its allies were trying to build a stable or modern capitalist society over all the years that they remained in Afghanistan? And if so, how do you explain that they utterly failed?
Well, I think it wasn't just that they were trying to build a capitalist society. They were trying to build a society based on a particular form of capitalism, which is neoliberalism. So what they were doing essentially is creating a state that was really a state in name only. I'll give you an example with the health sector. The entire health sector, all the public health, the clinics, the hospitals, were run by NGOs, were run by private charities. There was no tax collection whatsoever. There was people, warlords and other businessmen making millions and millions of dollars. None of that money went into any kind of public revenue, public coffers. The US had privatized most of its war fighting, so that, it had small numbers of troops on the ground, but it had a large number of private security contractors, most of whom were Afghans, many of whom were led by warlords. So a lot of basic functions of the state, whether it is providing healthcare or security, were privatized and moved into the NGO sector or moved into the private commercial sector. And that's, of course, is a recipe for instability. And that's what we saw is if you start paying private security contractors and pay them for intelligence, and then they go and kill the wrong people and just you've incentivized instability. And that's the root of it, I think.
Well, when I was reading towards the end of your book about how some of these, they were kind of like warlord capitalists at the same time, real estate speculators and so on, how they dealt with the different issues. I was reminded of reading about the so-called robber barons in the United States 100 or more years ago, with their own private militias, which they use not just to repress the working class, but also to fight each other. But the main difference was that at that time, they were actually expanding the means of production, building railroads, steel plants, and so on.
Yeah.
Whereas now, and it's not just in Afghanistan, it's the whole economy. It's almost like a casino, what they call a casino economy, and also a lot of it, and in particular in Afghanistan, is based on the drug trade and the poppy culture.
Poppy culture is a big part of it, but there's a lot more than just opium that these robber barons were getting rich off. I mean, they were getting rich off of, I mean, the real currency, the real way they were getting rich was contracts of any kind, you know, to build a road, to build a school. It didn't matter. Usually they wouldn't even build it. Okay. It was just contracts. And it was part of the corruption that starts at the Pentagon and in Washington, D.C. You know, they had these huge contracts subcontracted to an American company, then they subcontracted again to an Afghan company. And these are the guys getting really wealthy. And so they weren't really, and there was no incentive for them to, it's unlike, you know, the robber barons were incentivized to expand the means of production, right? Because that's partly how they got rich, is through like building the railroads and other such things. These guys were not incentivized to actually build anything in Afghanistan because all they needed was the contracts, and the contracts they got through their personal connections or they got through the corruption that was in DC. So it's really an example of just how utterly corrupt Washington, DC is itself. What the US did is it really just like outsourced the worst parts of the American political model onto Afghanistan. And so this is the result.
Well, I think you could make an argument that it's a symptom of an entirely different era of capitalism itself, not just in Afghanistan or the United States, but globally.
Well, yeah, I mean, I used the word neoliberalism before, but there's obviously a lot of parallels with neoliberalism and the Gilded Age, you know, in terms of the ways in which these individuals acted. I think the difference now probably is just how easy it is just to move the money around from one place to the other, and how global this whole system is. So a lot of these Afghan businessmen, you know, they have businesses, or they have their registered businesses in Dubai and in Washington, DC, and, you know, they go and they're essentially stealing, more or less. It's a legalized form of theft that they're getting in their contracts from, ultimately from American taxpayers through Pentagon contracts. They're spending, you know, a portion of what they're supposed to spend on the ground on building a road or whatever, and the rest are just going and building villas in Dubai or whatever. It's not even a productive type of capital. It's like it's rents of the worst kind, which is used. They're going to, you know, private consumption. It's another reason why, if you go to Afghanistan today, I was there a month and a half ago, and it's, you look at most of the countryside, you hardly find any paved roads. And if you think the amount of billions of dollars that were spent on this country, there's no paved roads. It's astonishing.
But isn't it also a symptom of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall?
In Afghanistan specifically, or you mean in general?
Globally, in this era of capitalism?
Well, yeah, it could be. I mean, it's just a longer discussion out of the 60s and 70s. So it's possible that that's part of it.
So we think of on a related question. Traditionally, we think of so-called foreign influences as being one or another government, to put it bluntly, one or another capitalist government. And in the case of Afghanistan, we tend to discuss the role of the US, obviously, and also China, India, Pakistan, etc. But we don't tend to think of other forces. For example, there is a rising working class movement in Iran. And if the working class succeeds in Iran in overthrowing that regime, how could that affect the situation in Afghanistan? Similarly, incidentally, I've seen you've written and spoken about the Arab Spring and about Syria. If that had succeeded, how would that have affected the situation in Afghanistan, but in particular with Iran and also the Indian working class?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the Arab Spring has succeeded. The immediate pressure point in terms of Afghanistan may have come through Qatar. So Qatar was a major force, I think, in why the Arab Spring did not succeed, leaving aside the other forces, which is the Russians and the Iranians and the Assad regime. But I'm talking about Syria specifically. But if you think about Libya and Syria, Qatar's played a pretty malign role in these areas. So it's hard to say how would that have looked if there was successful revolutions here that would have changed the calculus in Qatar, I don't know. I think the Iranian question is a much more interesting one. Iran hasn't been a major player in Afghanistan. They're involved, of course, but it hasn't been kind of a determining factor. Now, Pakistan would be really the determining factor. If there was some kind of end to the Pakistani military class that basically runs that country, if that had been overthrown, then of course the policy towards Afghanistan would be very different, and they would feel it immediately.
No, I'm not thinking only of the role of the governments, but for instance, as I understand it, the Hazara in Afghanistan are like culturally and ethnically linked with large sectors of the Iranian population. And so
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the challenge, I think, is if it was a working class uprising in Iran, I mean, the big problem is that there's not a very big working class in Afghanistan. You know, it's predominantly rural, and the Hazara area is some of the most rural areas. And it's everything from subsistence farming to, you know, small holding peasantry to, you know, that sort of thing. So as I'm sure you know well, the connection between working class movements and the peasantry is always a complicated thing. So it's unclear exactly how it would work. But there's a Iranian, the Hazara working class in Iran as people who are migrant workers is a very important part of what happens in Iran. You know, but that's, I'm still, yeah, I think just because of the severe underdevelopment of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is, to be honest, probably the most underdeveloped country on earth. And I don't know if enough people recognize that. So that has to be part of these discussions.
right, is one of the few countries where the great majority of the population is rural rather than urban.
Yeah.
Today. So, but that brings me back to my point, which is, well, it seems to me that from the point of view of the masses of people, that the situation in Afghanistan cannot be resolved just within Afghanistan itself, that it involves an entire regional struggle. And that's where the role of the working class itself, as opposed to the peasantry, where the role of the working class itself could come in as a central organizing force and a centralizing force within wider society. If we think about the working class as being beyond just Afghanistan.
For sure, for sure. If there was some kind of regional struggle, I think the Pakistani working class would have to be central in this as well.
Mhm.
You know, but for sure, yeah, it's you know, it's like the classic results and prospects argument. But you know, that Afghanistan no longer becomes a severely underdeveloped if it's in the context of a much larger uprising.
I see you gather where I'm coming from.
Yes, I do.
As a socialist, and it leads directly to my last question, which is, as a socialist, my view is that such a society, modernized society, is not possible in the former colonial world, and that it's only possible in conjunction with the building of real socialism, as opposed to what the Soviet Union tried to do. And it seems to me that Afghanistan stands as a poster child for that, and that your book really is an indication of that. Would you comment on that?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think it's a tragedy. Yeah, I completely agree. And what the Soviet Union tried to implement in Afghanistan is socialism in name only, and is actually antithetical to, I think, the principles of socialism. I mean, at the end of the day, 1 million people were killed by what the Soviets and the Soviet proxies, the communist parties in the ground did. 1 million people were killed, and you know, even positive attempts at reform, like the land reform, which is a good thing if there's land reform. At the time in the 70s, the regime tried to institute land reform. You know, the way they try to do it, which is completely top down and without any real base in the areas where the land reform is being affected, was basically led to its complete disaster, I think, and led to its failure, which also is, I think, a broader indication of that kind of Soviet style of the Soviet approach, which I think is gives lie to the idea that they are in any way genuine or were a genuine socialist force in the country.
So my final question is this, bringing it home. In the United States today, you're seeing not only the beginning of a strike wave, but in my view, what's even more important than that, the beginnings of a rebellion of the rank and file against the union bureaucracy that has controlled the union for long as I was a union member, and even before, which started in 1970. And I think that part of that development would have to be the beginnings of a movement for political independence for the working class. That is to say, for a true working class party. So it seems to me, you know, some of these questions can seem pretty far afield to the average worker today. But tomorrow, if you have a political organization that represents the working class, it has to deal with all issues, including questions like Afghanistan. And so how would workers and a workers' political organization deal with these issues? If you would have maybe any concluding comments on that.
Well, you know, it's on the one hand, you couldn't pick two countries that are more different, like Afghanistan and the United States, one being one of the richest countries in the world, the other being possibly the poorest country in the world. But it's interesting in the ways in which the fates of ordinary working class Americans is connected or linked to what happens in Afghanistan, because the billions of dollars that were spent over the last 20 years did not go to helping Afghans, nor did it go to helping Americans. It actually came from American taxpayers. And so in different but important ways, both Americans and ordinary Afghans were hurt by this conflict. And obviously Afghans way more because of the physical harm that they face, but the ordinary Americans did not benefit from this conflict either. And I think it points to the deeper links here. Now you have hundreds of thousands of refugees or more coming here into other parts of the Western world. And, you know, we should, I think, you know, obviously we should be doing everything we can to welcome them, to demand that our leaders allow them into our countries. At the same time, we should recognize that all of these refugees, even if the ones who are now fleeing because of the Taliban, the only reason the Taliban emerged as a force to begin with is because of the crimes of the American occupation. And so ultimately, all the refugees that are coming are ultimately due to US policy, which is the same policy that took billions of dollars that could have been used for healthcare and education and other things, and you know, use it to line the pockets of warlords and strongmen.
Well, thanks very much, Anand Gopal, and we will be looking forward to your next book.
Thanks a lot.